answers to those questions with 2 case studies to consider: the Voters Not Politicians campaign in Michigan and the Project Red Map campaign in Wisconsin. Tonight, we have the opportunity to examine the political strategy of gerrymandering with our honored guest, Doug Usher. Doug is a partner at Forbes Tate Partners in Washington, D.C., and has lectured widely on the changing nature of measuring public opinion and sentiment. He has appeared on MSNBC, CNBC, Fox News, CNN, National Public Radio, and CBC TV in Canada. As a pollster, Doug has been involved with state legislative campaigns where gerrymandering was a key issue, and has worked in the past with Democratic state parties to help understand data in ways that has helped them shape districts. Please welcome Doug Usher.
Thanks, everybody. Could you put on your masks, please? No, I'm just kidding. Thank you for having me here. You know, I feel like an honored guest, but I feel there's a little bit of nepotism. You might know my shy and not very outgoing mother, Marion Usher, who's on this. And anybody who's joining this from outside of the Mad River Valley has to send $100 to the Mad River Valley as a contribution to their efforts. So you can click off now, but otherwise you got to pay. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack to this, because as those of you who know me know, I take a little bit of I wouldn't say cynical, but a realistic view to how politics gets done in this country. And the same is true for political reform. So I think the things to think about, because obviously we're talking today about gerrymandering, but based on the composition and the discussion, it's why does the political system seem to work against Democrats too much of the time? And I want to take a step back and think about the political motivations as to why politicians act the way they do, and then how they've led to the reforms we have and the system we have, but then also strike a cautionary note about how we then reform to get to the next step. Because I think if we're being honest, a lot of political reforms tend to come from the left, and they tend to go with a sort of broad patina of better government, but with the hope of better outcomes for Democrats and progressives. And so with that said, I think if we're being honest about what we're trying to do, we should probably try to do things that get us what we want. So the first point I wanted to make was on motivations. And, you know, to me, what I've learned, and I haven't worked with candidates in a while, I'm working with a couple right now, but not directly on the ballot, but from when I did polling for candidates on the ballot from, you know, city council all the way to president, is that they have an extremely tough job. And what they do for a living is something that you just can't imagine the amount of work and pressure that they're under. And the reason for that is that there are very few avocations or vocations in the world where you get to ask every single person around you how you're doing once every period of time. And then if they say you're doing okay, you get to continue to have your job and make a living. And if they say no, you get humiliated in the public square and everybody laughs at you when you lose. And just to show like how that actually happens in practice, I had the pleasure at one point, and then the pain at the end of working alongside the lead pollster for the John Kerry campaign in 2004. Obviously, very exciting campaign. You know, we almost pulled it off and lost, et cetera. Very close race. And after the election, election's over, he concedes. 12 hours later, his staff leaves. 3 hours after that, the Secret Service leaves and leaves him alone. He catches a commercial flight back to Washington. So he was, you know, earlier in the day, the exit polls seemed to indicate he was going to be president. He was ready to move into the White House, and then he loses. The next day, he goes to Capitol Hill because he's still a senator, and he goes to Starbucks, and they ask, "What would you like?" And he said, "I'll have a latte." And what do you think the barista said? Said, "What's your name?" Right? So it's just incredible how cruel the system is. Now, So you ask yourself, why do people behave this way? It's because every politician is looking for an edge. They're looking for an edge, whether it's in terms of, standard political behavior, which is raising money, taking issue positions that work with their constituents, or, to be honest, doing things that cut corners. Now, when it comes to gerrymandering, I don't want to say both sides do it, because it's clear Republicans have done a much better job, especially in the states that are focused on in the movie, Michigan and Pennsylvania and North Carolina. And it's a shame, of course, that the court didn't overrule that. Democrats have done the same thing. And, if you look at Maryland, the state of Maryland had a Republican governor. They just elected a Republican governor. The congressional district is 8-1 Dems to Republicans. Why? Because Maryland is very well gerrymandered. When I was working for the Georgia State Party, back when Georgia was more Democratic than it is today, they were developing new models. This was new back in 2002, to try to do the same thing. The point isn't that it's good that gerrymandering happens. The point is that I think we should get a better sense of why people are acting the way they are, and what might feel immoral, and it may well be immoral, and certainly what feels racist in the side of the Republican Party, and I'm not going to justify it, but I will give a brief explanation, is politicians acting the way they always act. The reason why it feels especially fraught, and I'll give a sort of numerical reason for this, but it doesn't make it any better. When you do gerrymander, when you do divide districts, when you do analysis of politics, it's incredibly powerful to know if there's a single group that is much more likely to vote for you or much more likely to vote against you. You do that around how you run your campaigns. You do that around how you do turnout. The first, of course, and most valuable variable you have is their party, right? People don't walk around with it labeled on their heads, but having said that, a lot of states have party registration. If you know someone's party, you're 90 to 95% sure of who they're going to vote for in the election. And therefore, if you're doing your campaign, you want those people to turn out. Beyond that, there is only one other variable that comes even close if you look at every other variable. And that is whether a voter is African American. Being African American indicates that you will vote for the Democrat 90 to 95% of the time. Now, this is a bit of a circular argument, of course, which is to say, then Democratic, now Republican, Democratic pre, 1960s and 50s, going back to the Southern Democrats. It is the case that African Americans are so solidly behind Democrats that you can expect that Republicans will do what they can to limit participation by African Americans. It is not justifiable in that way. And I'm not suggesting it is, but I'm saying when you use computer modeling to build congressional districts, legislative districts, et cetera, you pick all the variables you can, and you saw that in the film. They sort of, had a little like RoboCop look of all the different variables. We on the Democratic side, if we wanted to gerrymander against them, don't have a variable that's that strong for prediction. The one that's closest is evangelical Christian. That's a little harder to get and to know for sure. And there's, of course, many different kinds of evangelical Christians. So that's something where you can get a 70 to 75% reliability. So that's just a little bit of background. Now, I wanted to just share with you a little bit of data, because while we'll talk about reform, I think one of the things that people are most worried about is what's going to happen in the US Senate. And there's been a tremendous trend. And so people say, why are people like Lindsey Graham going crazy, right? Why has he gone from being, I wouldn't say a moderate, but someone who's joined in some reform efforts? Why are these senators who have been, and why did Susan Collins vote for Kavanaugh, right? Why did these people act this way? And I sort of go back to the first issue, first question, which is, what's the motivation? What is the incentive? And I'm going to share a slide. The host has disabled screen sharing. Can you, whoever's hosting this, allow screen sharing if possible. That would be awesome. Yep, I just think it was just allowed. Perfect. So you should see a slide right now. I'm going to read it. If you can't see it, don't worry. I'm going to explain it. But this is a slide. This is some data to indicate how senators, which used to be and is supposed to be a very independent body, has become exceptionally tied to the party at the top of the ticket. If you go back 30 years ago, in a typical presidential election, half the states would vote for one party for the president and the other party for Senate. And you'll note the blue line, which is the one up the top, we've seen that number creep up and up and up and up. That is the number of states where it was a straight ticket. The same outcome for the president happened for the senator. And in 2016, for the first time in US history, 34 states where there was a senator up, there's approximately a third of the Senate up every 2 years, 100 people, 6-year term, do the math. For the first time in American history, 100% every single state voted the same at the top of the ticket as they did for senator. So if you're Lindsey Graham, the vote in South Carolina will vote for Trump and for that party below. So you've got to stay close to Trump. How's that working in this cycle? You've got people like Lindsey Graham who are, not doing as well as they should, but I mean, by any measure will ultimately win because the Trump voters will turn out, and when he wins, Trump wins South Carolina by anywhere from, at the minimum, 8 points and maximum 20 points, they'll show up for Lindsey Graham, unless Trump turns on him and he looks like an enemy. But let's go to the Democratic side. You have in Colorado, Cory Gardner, who's the current senator. Normally, an incumbent would always be in an advantageous position. Colorado will go for Biden. It may, again, if everything goes as is. It's not going to be close to the median state, meaning it's going to vote 7, 10, 12 points for Biden. Hickenlooper, the challenger for Gardner, will likely sweep in based on that because the ties between the top of the ticket and the senators have become so close. So these types of changes in how people are voting, and you just see how that partisanship just rode in 2016. There's nothing to see it changing by much. Now, there's a state like Maine. That's going to be a very close state, so you could certainly see it being close one way or the other. And there's a few other states. Michigan, people think the incumbent, Gary Peters, has a little bit more of an advantage, but that state again, so it's not likely to be 34 again, but we just figure out, we try to understand why do these people doing these things, go back to the first thing, which is their biggest, what they care most about is to be reelected, because that's, and it's not because they're bad people, they're running for office, right? It's like telling a surgeon, stop doing surgery, and they'll say, I don't want to, I've trained, this is what I do. And you'll say, well, doing surgery is not that good, it's a waste of money. People will still want to do that. The same is true here. I want to take a few minutes to go into reform itself and talk a little bit about reform. And again, this is my skeptical side, but I want you all to have as, to have as broad a view as you can. Is that I think that we should be cautious and be honest with ourselves when we talk about reform, right? Which is to say, what exactly do we want when we go for reform? And there's a number of folks on here. I think I saw Marty Tolchin, who's more of a veteran of any of this than I am, who's watching this right now. But if you go through the reforms, the unintended consequences have often been stronger than what was expected. A perfect example is campaign finance reform. Now, that was undone to a certain degree, of course, by the Supreme Court in the David Bossie case. So now there's unlimited amount of money. But even before that, we ran this campaign finance reform, but people found different ways to use different structures of PACs and committees to still funnel large amounts of money to campaigns. You look at presidential primary reform. Democrats have gone through this almost every cycle since 1968, which is, you know, it's being dominated too much by the activists. It's being dominated too much by a small number of folks who are pushing the party too far to the left, to the right, to the center. Of course, in 2016, you saw the Bernie campaign very upset about the notion of superdelegates. Well, superdelegates came to exist because before there were superdelegates, there was too much control being pulled away from the center of the party, both the Democratic, the central committees of the party and also the policy center. And so they created superdelegates, people who had run for office. Well, then it looked like that reform was a trick and rigged the election for Hillary. And go on to judicial reforms. There's a lot of reform right now around electing judges, right, versus appointing judges. Now, again, once you make a decision, you can't go backwards. You can, but it's pretty complicated. And I want to just bring up one more, which I think is really adjacent to gerrymandering, which is electoral college reform. And I will say personally, I think that that could be the biggest mistake we could make as a party. And we better watch what we ask for because we could get it. And I'll show you, because I think it's actually more than anything, it's a bit of an accident of history where we are right now to have two elections that were majority wins, and obviously it's possible again this time. And I just want to show you a chart, and I'll go through this because again, I want to talk about this. Of course, we'll talk about gerrymandering more, but I just wanted to point out, why is it the case that Democrats win more votes but then lose? And what you see in front of you, if you don't see it, it's a long chart from left to right that shows the margins by which Trump and Hillary won the states they won. Now, what is fascinating, if you take a look at this, obviously at the bottom it's really small. I highlighted the biggest states, the states with the most electoral votes. On the right-hand side, the Democrats are winning the biggest states, that is California, New York, and Illinois, by incredibly large margins. Those are wasted votes, meaning everything the party is doing to win another vote in Brooklyn and everything the party is doing to win another vote in Santa Monica is losing votes, potentially, again, it's a broad question, is at risk of losing votes here. On the Republican side, take a look at the biggest states. Republicans have been winning them by smaller and smaller margins. Obviously, Pennsylvania, Michigan, et cetera, they took by an incredibly small margin. So the idea is we as Democrats rack up votes in states where we just don't need to rack up votes anymore, right? Now, Republicans, they rack up their votes in Nebraska, Wyoming, West Virginia, Oklahoma, North Dakota. Their base is their base, and they've got that solid. They don't spend any time worried about them anymore, right? But if you take a look at what's going on right here, here's why I say be very careful what you wish for. Donald Trump will eventually leave office. I'm confident of that in some way, shape, or form. If Democrats were really taking an honest view of what we wanted to do, it's how do we stop wasting votes in California, and how do we start winning some more votes in these states? Because what's really interesting is if Democrats, if Joe Biden, and if you think about the presidential race, Joe Biden will, you know, he's in great shape. All things considered, this can all go away. There's no question about it, but you sort of take this as a point in time, he's in really good shape. If for some crazy reason he's able to maintain this lead, all of these states sweep over to the Democratic side. And all of a sudden, the electoral college reform we wanted to have doesn't help us anymore. And in fact, as a party, when you think about the long-term life of the party, and you think about, and this is just bring it around just for one final point, if you think about our viability in state legislatures, right, and across the country, if in the end we end up without an electoral college, we will go for that next vote in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And we will go for the next vote in New York and in Brooklyn. And that will help us for presidential races. But the policy position we have to take to get there will devastate us in state legislatures. Because the reality is, you can pretend all you want that America is, you know, just one vote away from Medicare for all, and America is just one vote away from civil rights for everybody, and America really does want, you know, full police reform, but that is not where the country is. And so if we as a party decide that we're going to put all of our energy in here and turn our governing coalition at the presidency to this, you know, we then will have control over the presidency looking 8, 12 years down the road. And everything that Trump did that bothers us right now, everything's going on gerrymandering, will happen from Congress, from a much more Republican Congress in that case. I'm not predicting that's going to happen. I'm just saying, change the rules and buyer beware. Okay? So I will stop. I think I'm actually over time in terms of our agenda. So I'll stop sharing right now and open up to discussion and conversation. On that depressing note.
Okay. Well, thank you, Doug. That was really good. What is going on here?
I think you just need to I think Phyllis Hanfling is sharing her screen. So you need to disable screen sharing. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. So what we want to do is we want to give people an opportunity to ask questions, and Doug actually answered one of mine, which was, what do you think about the Electoral College? So, and that was like, you know, in my hip pocket, so I really appreciate that. No, it's great. I appreciate it. So let me, let's just go over our group norms here, if I can.
Oh, by the way, there's a chat. So for everyone who's watching at home, if you look on the right side, if you look below, you'll see a chat button. And if you push chat, you'll see a chat show up on the right side. And if you're able to do it, if you have the technical capability, you can put in questions and type a message at the bottom, and you can add questions too.
Great. Great. And yes, that's exactly what we want to do. We just want to ask everyone to mute yourself unless you're asking a question. So when you write a question in that chat box, just preface it with question. And that way, if you have a technical problem or something, we can address that as well. I will call on you, and then you'll unmute yourself and you'll ask your question. And if you have any follow-on questions, you'll go ahead and ask those. And then once you're done, please mute yourself again. Please try to remain on the Zoom tab. We all get tempted, like by, you know, to do some multitasking, but try not to do that. And I know that we're all a respectful group, so we don't have to emphasize that. Monitor your airtime. We've only got a time for a few questions. And last but not least, you know, Murphy's rules are that we're going to have some technical issues, so please just bear with us if we do. So, who's got the first question? Anyone want to? And I'm going to have you put them in the chat box. You can just put in a couple of words if you want. You don't have to put in your full question, just so I know who to call on.
So Frank Vogel's asked for if you could write your question, Frank. There's one, but if you want to just unmute and talk, that's fine too.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead, Frank.
And while we're waiting, anyone want to
Hi, everybody. Doug, that was terrific. Thank you. I'm Frank Vogel, and one of the things I do in life is work on anti-corruption around the world. And so I got involved with the Michigan group in the gerrymandering film just before the elections in 2018. They did a phenomenal job. And I just want to make one little comment. What we're seeing through, and we saw it so well in the film, is that young people are basically saying, to hell with the whole system. We can work from the grassroots, we can organize, we can demonstrate, and we protest. And we are seeing that in so many countries around the world. And I think that one of the things that we should learn a bit from the AOCs and other younger members of the Congress is they've taken the same view. And so, Doug, I don't know how you react to that, but it seems to me that the gerrymandering film showed very clearly people are just, a lot of young people are fed up with the establishment political system and politicians and the rigged system, be it Democrat or Republican, and they want to go their own way, and they're having enormous impact. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Frank, that's a really important point. And I will also say I'm really pleased that in Michigan, a state where it's going to be very hard to overturn the legislature, that they're looking to move to a system that has appointed folks, et cetera. I worry, though, and this is, as sort of both the combination of being Democrats and good government people, that we're going to try to sweep the nation with the same thing. And then we're going to end up having it in places that we don't want to have it, right? My point is, we've got to think about the outcomes as well. And certainly young folks are for that. I'm not trying to be too cynical, except to say the attitude of to hell with it, we can do better is what Trump got elected. And so I want to be a little bit cautious in pushing too hard, but I definitely I'm excited about and energized about what younger folks are doing in politics. But in terms of, yes, the Michigan campaign was really impressive, and I just want to make sure that we don't unilaterally disarm as Democrats, which is to say, we will, unless we can get a way to get this as a national movement that attacks, both Republican and Democratic states in the same way, we could end up with, gerrymandering in the Republican states and good government committees in the Democratic states, and then we end up in even worse shape. But I think you're absolutely right, Frank, and that it's very exciting that they were able to do that. So I'm going to take I see the question from my niece, so why don't you go ahead and read that, because I have to take that one.
Caroline, do you want to ask that question, or do you want me to read it?
Sure, I'm happy to do it. Nice job, Uncle Doug.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, when you were talking about the Electoral College, you said, it looks good for Democrats right now to get rid of it, but it might not look good down the line. I understand that Democrats would presumably have to work harder for liberal voters in California and New York, but is there any real argument for not abolishing the Electoral College that isn't partisan?
Oh, yeah.
Saying it would be worse for the country overall if they had to court all these fringe voters?
Yeah, I mean, the argument, you can take, there's about 8, 10, 12, but I'll talk about the top few things that were put in place in the Constitution for the very purpose of being undemocratic, right? And by small d, not non-majoritarian. Electoral College is one of them. The Senate is another one. Obviously, separation of powers is also one. Given the judiciary power, which it invented and invested in itself over time, is another. Filibuster is another one, which is going to be a big issue coming forward, and we're going to watch progressive folks most likely follow through on their commitment to get rid of the filibuster, which, to me is insane, because as much as we would like to see gun control, et cetera, abortion would be banned by now, for sure. It would have been banned probably 15 years ago. You sort of go down the line in terms of what bad outcomes would have had because of that. So the reason, the Electoral College feels less robust than it did at the time of the founding, because at the time of the founding, it was actually state legislators that were making the decision, not voters. So the whole idea that there would be a vote for the president by people didn't make any sense at the time. But I would just say, my worry about the Electoral College is that as we think about some of the biggest problems in this country and some of the biggest divides becoming more and more divisive, I don't see that a system that invests power in smaller and smaller bubbles of folks, which is what getting rid of the Electoral College would do, is that helpful for our democracy as a whole? And it's the, of course, irony of the Federalist Papers, irony of the Constitution, and reading the Federalist Papers is just as relevant today as it was, however many hundreds of years ago. You have to balance the democratic imperative with, the notion of trying to have sustainability and stability over time. And so that's the argument. I don't know that it's the right argument. And clearly we make changes to the Constitution, we make changes all the time. But if we were going to make changes to the Constitution, I don't know that's where I'd start.
Thanks.
Audhart, you have a question.
Yes. One of the things that struck me during the video was that it says the Republican Party is shrinking. They're not getting any new voters. And because our country is becoming more multicultural. So I guess that leads me to the question why aren't the candidates trying to meet the voters where they are versus trying to disenfranchise them?
So, and just so I get what you're saying. I want to be sure I'm getting what you're saying. You're talking about about mail-in ballot, about polling places, et cetera, or there's sort of more of a policy position you're talking about?
I'm talking about gerrymandering. I'm talking about voter suppression. I'm talking about the whole ball of wax.
Yeah. In some ways, what you're talking about is one way to look at it is that, yes, Republicans are getting to be a smaller portion, but I have a little bit of an issue with that overall sentiment. But yes, no, they know that they will always do better if they can disenfranchise African Americans, because every 100 African Americans who are disenfranchised is 95 fewer votes for their opponent. So, that's one issue. Now, I guess if you take the long view, you'd say, well, why don't they try to incorporate these folks? Why don't they try to make the argument to the people? So this goes back to the question about whether Republicans are getting smaller and smaller, Democrats are getting bigger and bigger. I agree that the Republican demographic strengths are getting smaller and smaller, but they're not getting smaller fast enough, and they're not getting smaller in the right places. And so, I remember back in '96 when Bill Clinton won re-election, they said, this is it, it's over. The Hispanic population is going to grow through the roof. Democrats are going to take control. We're going to control California for a generation. That was true. And then we're going to start to control the rest of the country. That was not true. And so the final point I'll make is the other reason why they do these things is because, based on a combination of gerrymandering and just partisan belief and the lack of split ticket voting, the biggest challenges that many members of Congress have is not in the general election. It's in the primary. And I think they came up with that. They talked about that a little bit in the movie. And so some of these positions you're taking really take a lot of foresight and, sort of leadership skills that in the end, you watch what happens to members of Congress, and this is sort of supercharged in the Trump era. Republican members of Congress who have gone against Trump have watched their careers get cut short. Right. And if you look right now in the Senate, the only ones who are standing up to him are Mitt Romney. That's not really a profile in courage. He doesn't have a re-election for 6 years, and you look at the other folks who are doing the same thing. And then if you go to Jeff Flake, he got kicked out of Congress. He lost his seat. He couldn't win his seat again, and other folks like that. So I think in general, if you could have centralized control, Republicans would want to build up to get different demographic groups. But I think in the micro world of today, it's really hard to line up their incentives to make it happen.
Thank you.
Okay, Don Lubbock, you've got a question.
I have a question. Could Congress restructure the Electoral College decisions by allowing electors to each party that earned at least 10% of the total popular vote of that state?
Mm-hmm. So, the short answer is no, because the Constitution requires a time, place, and manner of elections, and how these are determined by the states. With that said, and so how a state determines how they're going to send the electors to Congress, the actual process is determined by the state. With that said, states can make that decision, and there have been some discussions of this. However, I think that, and this is getting beyond my expertise, but there's no way to centrally coordinate that unless, say, a block of states work together to do that. But from Congress, you can't determine how electors will get chosen in individual states. There'd have to be a constitutional amendment to make that determination. So Congress could pass it, Senate could pass it, but then you'd need it to be approved by 3/4 of the state, which, as we see with the ERA, takes a pretty long time.
Well, the principal amendment has gone not about as far as it can go. So I was wondering whether this was an alternative that would permit
So, I mean, the closest, sorry, go ahead.
It would permit the campaigning across the country instead of it being narrowly limited to a few critical states.
Right, but so then here's the other challenge, and so that's a separate question, which is, what if the Electoral College would be abandoned? What would the campaign look like? We would have this very weird campaign of Joe Biden sitting in California for months at a time, right, to get many more votes that he could get in bulk. You'd have Donald Trump in another part of the country. Their positioning would be all over the place, because in the end, you really aren't necessarily, so like if you're trying to dig up those votes, all of a sudden you're in this very strange situation. In fact, that is so dangerously unpredictable, right, Don? I hear what you're saying, and it could be better if you ran a campaign the way we did last, like now, and you got rid of the Electoral College, those two things together, that would be wonderful. But the reality is, if we changed the rules of the Electoral College, the campaigns would look very different. And I think that's also a point about Joe Biden, which is to say, and this is again my own sort of fear about what may or may not happen in the next couple months, but Joe Biden would have been a better candidate to run the 2016 campaign, because the questions that were asked about Hillary, and obviously misogyny, scandal, etc., will not stick as much to Joe Biden. But Joe Biden doesn't get to run the 2016 campaign. He has to run the 2020 campaign, which is going to start to look like Joe Biden is senile, here's all his gaffes, and that's going to be wrapped up. And then you'll say, oh my God, Hillary Clinton could have won this race, right? Hillary Clinton can win the 2020 race that's run against Joe Biden, just like Joe Biden could run the 2016 race, win the 2016 race against. But we've got to realize that we can't, again, this fits into the question of reform. We do a lot of reforms to address the past, right? We rarely do reforms in a smart enough way to address the future. And it's that uncertainty that I think all of you, again, as you work hard at the state level to try to win back legislatures and help with doing better gerrymandering rules, et cetera, just plan for the future, recognizing that everybody who behaves in a certain way over these rules will behave in a very different way when the rules are ended.
Judy, you have a question.
Judy, you're on mute.
We can't hear you.
We can't hear you. You're not on mute, but we can't hear you.
Is that better?
Yes, that's great.
Okay. So what's the solution? Like, are we doomed to just being like so totally partisan based that we never can get past there?
I mean, so the question of partisan is a tough one, because there's one thing which is partisanship, which is the idea that people organize into different groups for the purpose. I mean, going back to my political science PhD days, which it's a little bit traumatic to say the least. You need, parties are designed to organize legislatures and to organize elections. Meaning, if you have no structure and you have no institutional structure within the institution, it's going to be constant chaos. The same is true with elections. I mean, look at Italy, right? You have a huge number of parties, things are all over the place. we have a two-party system. It doesn't have to be Democrats and Republicans, but it kind of has to be two parties based on the rules of our voting. Now, some states are experimenting with different types of voting systems, but if you have a 50% plus one voting system and winner take all, you sort of go down the line, there will be two parties, because the idea, if you want to win durably, you need to have one versus the other. One may come in and kill one of them, but there really won't be a sustainable three-party system. So that's the question of partisanship. The question is, how do we deal with this intense partisanship? And the way in which people don't do anything with each other anymore. And I hate to say it, but I think the reason why is because, unfortunately, some of our efforts at Sunlight have made it impossible for members of Congress, for party members, to work with people on the other side. So, the old saying in Congress was, you tax, spend, reelect. The idea is for the first, year and a half of your cycle, you raise taxes, you spend a bunch of money, and then you tell everybody you spent all this money, look how great everything is. Today, on day 2, when you hold a meeting with someone from the other side, it gets blasted on social media, right? And then within 3 weeks, if you're a Democrat, the progressive comes in and says, that person's working with those terrible Republicans, right? And they get challenged and they lose. So they're literally afraid to do that. So, I don't know what's going to break that, to be honest, because that's really tough. And it's got a stranglehold on incredible numbers of members of Congress. I think it's possible that the redrawing of the lines may have a bit to help with that, but not the way things are going. But I think partisanship is okay. I think the idea that we have different parties is fine, but the idea that we can never work together and never talk to each other is a real struggle that is tough to get beyond. And I think you sort of add to that the constant churn of social media. One day take a critical look at the news that's being fed to you, including the New York Times, including others. You're being fed news that you've clicked on, right? The front page of the New York Times may be ordered in a typical way, but once you click into an article, all the articles that come below and it says you should also read is based on your behavior to basically get you to read more stuff. And that's going to further reinforce those things. So all these make it challenging to keep an open mind.
Mary, ma foi.
Yes, I was wondering about the proportioning of votes from the electors in electoral colleges. And some states like Maine do allow their electors to vote according to the proportional votes in the state. And if more states did that, how would that affect the Democratic Party?
So that's a great question. And in fact, you're making a great point. I'm doing work on a campaign inside of Maine. And because Maine has a split system, there's going to be in Maine, between the Senate race, presidential race, and a couple of other initiatives, one of which I'm working on, about $125 million spent in the state of Maine this year. And that's largely because, since it's a split system, there are always going to be efforts to win that. I think, yeah, as you move towards I'd say in the short term, if you move towards a system like that, it would get away from the Electoral College. And Democrats have had, we've had electoral pluralities or majorities in every election, save 2 since 1988.
Right.
So yes, but I'm saying in the long term, sort of watch yourself, because it may not work out
argument.
that way. Yeah.
It's not like abolishing the Electoral College, but it still has the same end result. What you're
Right.
saying.
So, like we could win, there are places where we could win additional seats, right? But, Maine divides it by, so just sort of take this argument forward. Maine divides it by congressional district. Places that do this tend to, Nebraska does it also, divide by congressional district.
Mhm.
Well, now gerrymandering is going to affect the presidential race.
Right.
So you create that reform, and all of a sudden people are going to reorganize congressional districts based on presidential vote in addition to congressional vote. And what's to say you should do it based on congressional district and not on legislative district? right?
Thank you.
So
Very depressing.
I'm not being depressing. I'm just wanted to like, let's try to just think a little bit ahead of, the passion of this moment and think a little bit about just be sure that as we direct our passion, in this case, to defeating gerrymandering in places where it's killing Democrats,
Yeah,
also think about, the next step and what's going to happen.
thanks.
So we have time for a couple more questions, and we're going to go to Marty Rosenfeld.
I think it's Marty Tolchin.
Oh, I'm sorry,
That's
Marty.
okay.
It's from Barbara Rosenfeld says that Marty has a question.
I know.
Marty
Sorry
has
about that.
Marty has
I know.
taken his wife's name at a very young age.
Yeah, it just happened after my surgery, my transsexual surgery. No, my question, first of all, just a comment. I think the courts have now ruled that electors cannot be independent, that if they were elected as Democratic or Republican electors, that they have to vote for the party's candidate. But my question is, why do Republicans do a much better job on gerrymandering than the Democrats? Is it that they usually control more legislatures, or they're more intent, or I don't understand why.
I mean, the short answer is I think it's certainly recently they have. I'm not sure and so two things have come together, or maybe three things have come together. One is the development of software that can allow you to do things at the block level that you could never do before. The second is the growth of money in politics, which is to say people thinking more strategically about where to put money. And when you have $1 billion, you can put millions of dollars into these places. Republicans tend to have more cash on hand to do that. And, the third reason, which I'm a little bit more wary of, is that they're more cutthroat than we are. Like, we never managed to have the guts to do that. But I will say, if you listen to Republicans talk about Democrats, especially in places like California, in places like Maryland, they say Democrats, and they talk about Nancy Pelosi, they make fun of her, but they're just like, she'll cut off your arm and leave you smiling. Like, we're not so bad at it. And if you look at Maryland as one example, we've done extremely well. I will say that I think Republicans put a little bit more, they give ideologically, for whatever reason, they give a little bit more leeway to their folks who are will say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to win. Just let me do it. And I don't want to hear any more from you. I think Democrats are a little bit more cautious about that, because I think we have more of an instinct that there is a better good in good government that we should be representing. So I think that Democrats are a little bit less willing to do that. But I will say we are not unwilling to do it. After Trump, especially after the census, presuming that we can actually control in the end where the census numbers, when they're finally determined, I think that we'll do a much better job after seeing what happened.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we still have a little bit of time for another question or two, but Doug, I want to ask you, I know, early on when Tisa was talking to you, you had talked about, helping us think about what we can do at the grassroots level. The problem it felt like a big problem, and then we do some work and it feels like we've got control over it, and now it feels like, after hearing you, it feels like this is really a big thing for us to deal with, our little Vermont group. So what can grassroots efforts do?
I mean, the first question is what is it you want to do, right? Like, I think you have to come to some sort of conclusion internally of what the most important thing, your most important proximate direct goal is. Is it to get Trump out of office, right? Is that your most important goal? Then you should, put in as much effort as you can into doing peer-to-peer communication to get voter turnout. right? I mean, that's sort of the most important thing you can do if that's what you decide you want to do. I also think that everybody should be, and I'm a hypocrite for saying this because I don't do enough of this, but no matter what you're doing nationally, if you're not involved locally in some way, shape, or form, you're not learning, right? So if you've never been, and I use Washington as an example, if you've never been to an advisory neighborhood commission meeting in DC, you're not understanding what's going on everywhere in the country, right? But so I would say, like, have a big, broad goal that everyone can get behind. I think, de-electing Trump is probably the most important in everybody's mind. And so when you say grassroots, I think of peer-to-peer communication and the extent to which you can extend peer-to-peer communication to places that, to 95% vote likelihood folks, to get them out to vote and make sure they're going out to vote. I think that's as important as you can get. But I also, I recommend, especially those who are full-time residents in Vermont, you darn well better go to the March 1st meetings, right? I mean, don't pretend you're doing politics if you don't know what's going on in your neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, I will say the beauty of Vermont is that we are human scale, and we can walk into our state house at any time that they're in session, and we can talk to our legislators, and we're very lucky here in that
Absolutely.
way.
It costs a little more here in Washington.
Yeah. So Aude, I'm going to have you ask the last question, and then I would like to spend a few minutes just talking about what we're doing at Indivisible Mad River Valley, because I think it does fit with what Doug is suggesting we should be doing.
Hi.
Go ahead, Aude.
Oh, hi. At the end of the movie, the Supreme Court seemed to punt on making a decision on gerrymandering as a federal issue. And at least that's how I saw it, is that they were saying it's a state issue. How do you feel about that? Is it federal or is it state?
So I think, I don't know that they said that. I think what they said, I think there were 2 points. One was that they punted originally and said they couldn't decide whether North Carolina's decision was constitutional because of standing issues. And again, I love to pretend I know something about law. But then in the end, they said not that it's not a federal issue. The courts could do it, but what they said was the case didn't rise to court intervention because politics is inherently part of this process. So they said, you're coming to us saying it's unconstitutional because it was too political. And the reality is they said, no, it's not too political at all. So I think it's wrong. And I think that if you look at previous gerrymandering decisions through the years, that there's always been, among other things was like, very early gerrymandering decisions were that people were putting too many people in a district, right? Saying there are more people in the district, fewer in this. They said, look, one person, one vote is a real issue. But I think what the court is saying, and it's at least a marginally legitimate argument, which is to say, this has been done forever. As long as people have been drawing lines, they've been drawing lines to benefit one party over another. That it's been mastered is an issue. And I think the biggest concern I had looking at the movie was the idea of the deleted files. And I think the reason why that's problematic is because, and not that the court necessarily would have ruled on this, but when I did some work with the Georgia State Party, and they said explicitly, we can't do any analysis on race based on Civil Rights Act. Meaning, as Democrats doing it, we couldn't use African Americans as a proxy for Democratic votes because it was unconstitutional. I'm 100% sure that in those files, they used race as a primary category. And so deleting those files meant that nobody could see that the map was drawn based on race.
Okay, well, we've asked Doug if he would stick around with us a little bit longer after we talk a little bit about Indivisible Mad River Valley. So if you have any other questions, pop them in the chat, and we'll make sure that he answers them. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what we are doing at Indivisible Mad River Valley and how you can join us. Just a moment to get this up and running. So, whoops. bear with me. There we go. So, you know, typically, like Doug had suggested, you know, if you guys want to get rid of Trump, then, you know, we should really be focusing our efforts on candidates. And that's typically what you think of when you think about outreach during elections. You think about it at the national level, you know, primarily for the president, but sometimes for the House, sometimes for the Senate. And so these are, you know, candidate-focused approach. And at Indivisible Mad River Valley, we're taking a little different approach. And that is because we feel very, very strongly that the more people who get out to vote, the better chance we will have of a blue tsunami. So we're really taking a voter-focused approach. We're doing a lot of work helping get voters registered, helping educate voters, making sure that polling places are open. We had a team of people calling last week trying to recruit poll workers, because if there aren't poll workers, polls aren't going to be opened and people aren't going to be able to vote. We're educating people about vote by mail. We're working to get the vote out, and some of us are actually working on voter assistance hotlines. Now, we're not doing that in the state of Vermont because the state of Vermont's a pretty safe place. So we've chosen 5 states that we're working in, and 3 of them were highlighted by Doug in his presentation. We're working in Georgia, Florida, and Pennsylvania, and also North Carolina and Wisconsin. And we are working on the ground with organizations in those states, working on these voter-focused activities. We are also doing a little bit of state-level activity as well, helping state representatives and state senators, and that's because of that gerrymandering issue. Because if, for example, Pennsylvania can flip the state to blue, they'll be able to draw the redistricting lines in 2021. So what can you do? How can you help? How can you get involved? And we're inviting everyone, even you folks in the DC area. We actually, in an event like this that we did a couple of weeks ago on suppressed voter suppression, we recruited a man, Ralph, who is now on our phone banking team, and he's from Washington, DC. So you're all welcome to join us. We have a lot of fun when we get together and we do these activities. So we have the Fab 5, which are now the Fab 4, because we're not doing any face-to-face canvassing or knocking on doors. But we have a giving circle, which is a great way for people to make contributions to, this month we're contributing to 6 candidates in Georgia and North Carolina. We do that by pooling our dollars. So, you know, we're not putting up huge amounts of money on our own, but when we pull it together, it's a substantial amount. We're doing phone banking, and by the way, Doug, your mom is like one of our phone banking heroes. We love hearing her conversations and hearing her talk to people, and it's one person at a time, but sometimes, you know, one person at a time is what it takes. In a lot of these races, it's not huge numbers that we're looking for changing. We have a text banking team, and that takes a little more technical savvy. But these are all things that we will train you in how to do. We also write postcards. We have a huge postcard writing team. You're welcome to join our postcard writing team, but we're really working on building our phone banking and text banking teams. So how to get started? Tomorrow we have an informational session. It'll be at 5 p.m. I realize everyone might not be able to make it. In the morning, we will send you an email and you'll read about it, and you can choose to join us tomorrow at 5, and Dana and I will walk you through these different opportunities and help you try to figure out what is best for you. And if those don't work, you can email us and we'll work directly with you one-on-one to figure out what will work for you. We are all volunteers. We're not paid to recruit you. We're doing this because we feel very strongly about it. Many of the people who are working with Indivisible Mad River Valley have been doing it for 3.5 years. I personally just joined in March, but we all care very much about it, and we're trying to build a bigger team as we move into the election season. So That is my field. Does anyone have any questions about indivisible Mad River Valley, or do you have any other questions for Doug?
I mean, I don't know if it's a good sign that my father's wandered off, but I think that.
Yeah.
Doug, can I ask a question? Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead,
Sure,
Phyllis.
Phyllis.
Your audio is not great, Phyllis.
Yeah, you're right. It's on my other phone. So I want to know I got to get this other phone off. What impact will this rap singer, whose name I can't remember, have on this election? Because he's going to get on the ballot here.
I mean, my guess. Look, I don't think it's going to be a big. It's.
Oh shit! I can't hear.
His name is Kanye West. All right, hey Phyllis, I'll catch you later on that because I can definitely tell you. But as those who may know, Kanye West is a rapper, a very famous guy. Also, sadly, also struggling with some mental illness too. It seems unlikely that he's going to be in that many ballots. I don't think it's going to make a big difference. To be honest, I think in the end it's going to be a relatively unimportant campaign. And he's also said he's a Trump supporter. I mean, it's not. I'm not concerned about that, nor do I think that we should spend too much time worrying about it because there's not much you can do.
Any other questions? Carolyn Heft. You're muted, Carolyn.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah,
Am I
unmuted.
unmuted?
Yes,
Yes.
you are.
There are Republicans who have come out, I believe, and there will be more, who are not supportive of Trump. And if the election, you talk about the statistics where in the recent elections there were the votes for Senate and president or whatever were same party. Will people get smart enough to perhaps stick to their Republican vote for the senator, but still vote for Biden for president?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's. I think that in the end, I mean, here's one of the I hate to get all technical, but it's a bit of a statistical problem, which is a lot of Republicans who've come out and said they're not going to vote for Trump don't call themselves Republicans anymore, right? They say the Republican Party has left me, and so. And the other thing to add to this is that a lot of Republicans who are upset with Trump are upset with Republicans in the Senate as well. So I think it's wonderful that Republicans are saying they're going to vote for Trump. I don't think it has the same.
They're not going to vote for Trump.
I'm sorry, Republicans are not going to vote for Trump. But I think that the impact of that sort of thing in a different election, like when Republicans came out against George H.W. Bush, right? That was a big deal back in '92. I think that the whole point of Trump is that if people don't agree with him, then they're part of the problem. And so to your question about whether those folks will then turn around and vote for Senate, I think it's possible. I think, look, the trends are such that we should expect that if you look at the swing Senate races, and I'll just put this out just as a way to think about it, if the presidential race is going to be determined by 5 or more points in either way, assume that the senator underneath that will have the same percentage of votes for their party. Like, I just think that to overcome that 5 points in this highly partisan, highly charged atmosphere is going to be really challenging. The places to watch, I think, are Montana, where Governor Bullock is, a hometown favorite, and he's won in that Republican state as a Democrat. And so maybe he could overcome it. He can't overcome 15 points, but maybe he could overcome 5 or 8 points.
He's fantastic.
Yeah, he's great.
I heard him talk for Columbia University, where he went to law school, and I was very impressed.
Yeah, Go ahead.
Is that it, Carolyn?
Yeah, I hope I'm alive when Bullock runs for president.
Susan, did you have a question?
Well, I did. Doug, would it be helpful what is the relationship between people doing their census report form and the election and gerrymandering?
That's a great question. The biggest problem right now is the idea that Trump has tried to stop counting immigrants that are undocumented as part of the count.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's a serious potential issue, both around apportionment. So there's apportionment, which is where you give the states the number of members of Congress and hence the electoral votes they have, as well as the redistricting itself. So yes, if not only does he say he's not going to count them, but they're also unwilling to provide their documentation or provide to fill out the documents, you have a bit of a cascading effect that's going to harm North Carolina and New York and California. Frankly, it may harm North Carolina as well, and help states that are a little bit less immigrant focused. Just as one strange turn in the world of census, back in 2000, Utah lost a seat. And the reason why they lost a seat is because such a large percentage of their youth are missionaries. So you turn 18 and you go to another country.
Other Mormons?
And
I see.
the Mormons who go to other countries.
Yeah.
And so Utah could not, lost a seat in the 2000 election on a razor's edge of 5,000 versus another state.
Yeah.
Because you have to be counted in the country at the time. It really is not citizenship based. It's based on physical placement. And then just on the other side, prisons, you're treated as a resident of the state where you're in prison.
Oh.
And so different parts of states as well as different states have increased population based on prison population of people that have come from urban areas, but the urban areas will lose resources because folks are incarcerated far away from their home.
So we want Democrats to fill out their census forms.
We want everyone to fill out their census forms. I mean, I don't see a connection necessarily between partisanship and that. I mean, because in the end, if you don't have Republicans filling out your census form, you're also going to have problems with all types of resource questions.
Right, that's right. Federal funding and stuff like that. So we want everybody to fill it out. Right.
Yeah. But yes, if you were being, instrumental on it, you would say, oh my God, California is now 50 times the size of,
Well, a lot of people don't realize that federal funding is dependent on, the census is that important. They just think it's the government snooping. They don't realize there's so many things to know and so many things to put our attention on. It's hard to pick and choose. So it's nice when somebody lets people know in a couple of sentences, you're filling out that form supplies federal funding for the state, for our state and whatever else.
That's great. Let's have a last question because I've got.
We have to have two. We have to have two last questions. We have to have Tisa is going to have a question, and then your mom is going to wrap it up for us. Go ahead, Tisa.
I have a question.
Oh, Marion, let's let Tisa ask her question first.
Okay.
Well, of course, I have to ask this. What do you think about the impact of Biden's vice presidential pick?
First of all, I think vice presidential picks have become much less consequential than they've been in the past. And the reason I say that is because in years past, a vice presidential pick could bring a state along with them, right? A vice presidential pick could, in a time when people had less information about individual candidates, they would have the VP, and that would help to do it. Go back before I was born to, Lyndon Johnson brought Texas to Kennedy, right? You sort of look at different ways that it balances the ticket electorally. I think right now the only thing you can do is really screw it up. And I think in the end, no matter who is picked, there will be lots of reasons why it was a terrible pick for Biden and lots of reasons why it was a great pick for Biden. Like, I'm just preparing you that the onslaught will be that Kamala Harris, she's a disaster. That Susan Bass, she's a communist. That, Meg Whitmer, she doesn't know, what's going on. And so I'm just suggesting that I think that based on what, he's not doing anything insane in terms of who he's picking. So I think it'll be a short run story. My biggest concern, and I'm actually happy that he's taken time to do this is that it takes the attention off of Trump and the problems of leadership and provides another target that people are going to attack. So that's why I'm queasy about the whole thing. But the idea that like the right VP is going to turn everything around or do the best things, no, you're going to see people are going to react exactly the way they did before. Which is those who like Biden are going to love the pick, and those who don't like Biden are going to say she, of course, it's going to be a woman, is the worst, has set Democrats back 50 years.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tisa. Marion.
So I have a question, Doug, and then I want to thank you. What impact do you think that the Lincoln Group ads are having on those committed Republican voters?
I don't think they have much impact on Republican voters. I think that they're actually, ads like that make Democrats excited, right? And so we give more money to the Lincoln, there's some of it's self-sustained, like, oh my God, Republicans are doing this, let me give them money, right? And then the second part, which I do think is really, is the best part of what they're doing, is they're aimed specifically at making Trump a little crazy. And I think that in the end, that's something Democrats haven't done a good enough job, which is we're like a bunch of dogs on a porch and Trump throws a ball and we go leaping after, like, oh my God, he can't change the election. Instead of realizing that's not what bothers him. He actually is doing these things to get us to do that. If instead we focus specifically on things, making fun of him, making him look ridiculous, making him suspicious of the people around him, those are the things I think that make him make missteps. And I think the Republicans to whom that appeals are already on our side.
Right, good. So thank you for doing this, Douglas. Makes your father and myself very proud, and we learned a lot, and so we're very grateful. And we can't wait for you to get here with your family in Vermont and enjoy the greenery and all these wonderful people.
And the mosquitoes.
No, we're pretty
No
down
mosquitoes.
on
No mosquitoes this year? Fantastic.
No, we
All
have
right.
butterflies. We have butterflies.
Great.
Yeah, so we would like to thank you also, Doug. This has been really great. I think that it got people really thinking about just another angle of this election and another way that we can make some headway. If we have some successes in November, hopefully we'll have a lot of successes. Just want to remind people of one fact that we heard in the Slay the Dragon film, and that is that 45,000 people were denied the right to vote in Wisconsin in 2016 due to voter ID laws. Donald Trump won Wisconsin by 22,000 votes. So it really is about getting out the vote and making sure that people who want to vote are able to, and that their votes are not suppressed. And that's what we're doing at Indivisible Mad River Valley, and we hope that you'll join us.